Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a great honor and a thrill to be a guest at your Distinguished Writers Festival. And for a North American traveler, it's something of an ontological accomplishment. And particularly to follow your opening night program last night, which was such an intellectually and emotionally stirring experience. Who would have thought that an American might journey all the way to Australia to learn something original about one of our classic American novels, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, in Kim Scott's personal reflections on Mark Twain's novel of American boyhood. My talk tonight is called A Wounded Deer Leaps Highest, Motives for Metaphor. Many of you are familiar with the thesis of The Wound in the Bowl, 7 Studies in Literature, 1941, Edmund Wilson's highly influential examination of the works of Sophocles, Casanova, Dickens, Kipling, Wharton, Hemingway, and Joyce as the works relate to their lives. In Wilson's theory of the genesis of art, it's argued that the artist is one who has suffered a mysterious wound, and that art is a response to this wound, a compensatory strategy, in effect a kind of fierce and protected denial of the primal wound, the wound that never heals. Recall Freud's succinct description of the artist and his craft, quote, art hallucinates ego mastery. Which I've always thought is a rather cynical remark, that there's a sort of mastery that the ego is hallucinating. Ironically, art can hallucinate a kind of mastery even when the art is, like Samuel Beckett's great work, almost entirely about disintegration and loss of control, that is, a loss of mastery. To gain control of loss, one must catalog loss, one must give it a name, a form, a meaning. Consider the famous opening lines of Elizabeth Bishop's poem, One Art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Emily Dickinson is our great artist of loss, oblique tragedy, unspeakable sorrow, translated into unexpectedly vivid dramatic images. A wounded deer leaps highest. I've heard the hunter tell. 'Tis but the ecstasy of death, and then the break is still. The smitten rock that gushes, the trampled steel that springs. A cheek is always redder, just where the hectic sings. Mirth is the mail of anguish, in which it cautious arm, lest anybody spy the blood and you're hurt, exclaim. Through literary history, from Renaissance sonneteers who, quote, sweated with heat, yet were, quote, freezing cold, who starved, pined, and thirsted in the throes of love, making of their intensity of their emotions the most exquisitely wrought verse, to contemporary writers who take as a task the recording of the most minuscule details of their lives, it has seemed that the quintessential artist feels more deeply than others and is unusually sensitive. To claim that the wounded artist is probably more sensitive than other people, however, may be a false claim. Is Stephen Dedalus really more sensitive and more nuanced in his emotions than Leopold Bloom? Faulkner's Benjy of The Sound and the Fury, wholly lacking speech, may be the most sensitive of all the Compsons. It is entirely possible that non-artists are as sensitive as artists, but lack the resources, the talent, the time, and the energy, and the desire to express their sensitivities as artists do. That is, to labor to create products that require effort, craft, vision, and cunning, and the leisure for these, which is not so common in history. Who can say but that enslaved persons and indentured servants were not among the most sensitive inhabitants of the North American continent, but were forbidden to express their visions? Who can say that entire cultures existed before the settling of the continent that were eradicated by the conqueror or in the ways of acquisition dismissed as of no aesthetic or moral worth? Who knows but that the illiterate are not in fact often more eloquent than the literate, but have lacked the means to express their eloquence? As Virginia Woolf asked, what of Shakespeare's sister? Why have we not heard of her? We all know why we have not heard of Shakespeare's sister, let alone read something by her, and by countless others who have been oppressed, their voices muffled and extinguished. I have been one acquainted with the night, Frost says in his beautifully nuanced sonnet. I have outwalked the furthest city lights, in a dream landscape of self-recrimination where, quote, the time was neither wrong nor right. No one has ever lived who has not been in some significant way wounded. Eventually, life wounds us in the simple living of it. Those we believe to be permanent around us, a fixed and reliable audience to our smallest dramas, begin to fall away and vanish. How chilling to realize as a child that you are not the center of others' concern. How chilling as an adult to realize that your love for others will not be enough to save them. Yet most people don't cultivate an art to compensate for woundedness. Obviously, there's something special, something extra about the individual who is to become an artist. Otherwise, everyone would be an artist. The fallacy is to think that art is only a consequence of woundedness, or to use a more clinical term, neurosis, or indeed, that art has any essential relationship at all with woundedness. It's as likely that art is a sustained and cultivated expression of the child's enormous capacity for playful creation, fantasizing, and storytelling. Here, I think, is the true wellspring of art, sheer astonishing energy. Yet there are those who find themselves deeply moved by the woundedness of others, which may be more extreme than their own and more worthy of attention. If art is in some essential way a mirror held up to its time, it's also a distorting mirror. It's not merely a reflective mirror. It does not care to present what merely is. Perhaps it is a worthier challenge to tell the stories of others, our neighbors, with as much care as if they were our own, a variant on the most elemental of ethical injunctions, do unto others as they would do unto you, which is to suggest that the expression of woundedness may not be traced back exclusively to personal experience. You might, if you are sympathetic, if you have a natural concern for others, have only to glance up from your own life, out of your own experience, to see that there are others, many others, who have not your advantages, perhaps, and might require you to speak for them or to aid them in speaking for themselves, and in so doing call attention to them. If they cannot tell their own stories, it's possible that you might tell their stories. Perhaps in the end it is the powerful story that must be told that is embodied in a singular work like Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, for instance, or Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the identity of the story or storyteller is not so significant. I speak as one who was not romantically wounded into art, but rather looked up from my life, from the protective aura of my family, and saw in the near vicinity of our family farm in western New York in the 1940s and 1950s. We lived in the snow belt, which is just as grim and pitiless as it sounds. The lives of children my age and the lives of their families, astonishing stories of pain and loss and protracted privation and hardship that I think would have defeated me. Yet these children, or most of them, persevered, like my own parents who lived through the Depression, maintaining what I recall as the most remarkable optimism and a total lack of self-pity. How ironic these Americans who had virtually no schooling, who had to drop out of even rural schools by the age of 12 in order to work, embodied the self-reliance of which Emerson spoke from a position of privileged authority. That vanishing or vanished America. What galvanizes some of us into art isn't "this is my story," but "how is this not my story?" Bearing witness is very possibly the most inspiring of literary motives, has moved beyond the boundless energy of sheer creativity of childhood. Allowing others to see what should be seen, what should not be allowed to vanish. The lives of our ancestors, for instance, who were in their time immigrants coming to a new world, often under terrible conditions, in a time before social welfare of any kind, when public amenities were few and nothing could be taken for granted. This is the great drama of North America, immigrant succession and assimilation. When I first began school in the early 1940s, there were no school buses, at least not in the wilds of rural western New York State. You walked to a one-room school a mile or 2 miles through devastating winter winds and snowstorm, or you didn't. No one would much care and no one would miss you. By the time I entered 6th grade, there was bus service to carry me to school in a small city 7 miles away, and buses would carry me to school for the remainder of my public school education. And this public education allowed me in time to make my way into a very different America and eventually here to this very podium. In our American New Dark Age, I mean right now, of meanness and privation, in which tax money for public amenities has been routed into bloated military budgets, and the very concept of public commonweal is under attack, it is good to recall that nothing can be taken for granted. No vigilance on our part is excessive in protecting our hard-won democratic institutions. Bearing witness means giving voice to those whose voices have been muted or destroyed, those who have been victims, those whose stories require a larger audience than they have received. The boldest act of bearing witness in American literature is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, an astonishing, imaginative achievement in the form of a melodramatic fiction exposing the horror of slavery to a mass market readership at a time when the teachings and preachings of abolitionism were reaching an impassioned but very limited audience. And thinking of Stowe's radical appropriation of lies very different from her own makes me think of Eudora Welty's memorable short story, Where is the Voice Coming From? From 1963, an exquisite miniature in which Welty dares to take on the voice of a white, racist Mississippian male who murders a black man in circumstances approximating the murder of an NAACP field secretary, Medgar Evers, in June 1963 in Welty's hometown of Jackson, Mississippi. Two white women writers of what might be called the genteel class, stirred to moral indignation by the horrors of history erupting around them and daring to write. The wish to move others to a course of action through sympathy evoked in a repertorial manner, this is the basis for political propaganda art, but there are works of art that transcend their circumstances. Most of the great novels of Dickens, but particularly Hard Times and Oliver Twist, Stephen Crane's early, crudely effective Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, the first and renowned of nearly 100 books by Sinclair, a devout, lifelong socialist. Frank Norris's McTeague and the Octopus are savage critiques of rapacious American capitalism. Class war might be identified as the basis of such novels as Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie and An American Tragedy, and John Dos Passos' enormously influential USA. The failure of American society to live up to its democratic ideals in such work of fiction as Sinclair Lewis's Main Street and Babbitt, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden, and Of Mice and Men, and the most astonishing of visionary and revolutionary novels from a perspective until the time of its publication in 1940, virtually unknown to American readers. Richard Wright's Native Son, a Dostoevskian descent into the abyss of northern, urban, racist America that refused to indulge its readers with a heroic black protagonist whom they might champion like the so-called good Negroes of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even in our postmodern era, mainstream American literature, with its predilection for liberal sympathies with the disenfranchised and impoverished, the great effort of 19th and 20th century novel to draw attention to social justice and inequality remains the most attractive of literary traditions. In Toni Morrison's classic Beloved, for instance, slave narratives have been appropriated and refashioned into a highly stylized art, both morally incensed and aesthetically ambitious. E.L. Doctorow began his career by reconstructing the lives of the atom bomb spies, quotation marks around that term, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg in the Book of Daniel. Through the much-acclaimed Ragtime, Loon Lake, World's Fair, and The March, Doctorow appropriated for his subject the volatile issues of class and race in America. Doctorow's more recent novels have been shaped by oral history. Quote, every writer speaks for a community. Other writers whose work is suffused with a sense of social justice and wish to dramatize the vagaries of American life with no diminution of art include Robert Stone, whose Dog Soldiers, A Flag for Sunrise, and Damascus Gate are among our great political novels. Russell Banks, whose sympathy for individuals both like and radically unlike himself has given us such extraordinary works of fiction as Continental Drift, Cloud Splitter, The Darling, and Lost Memory of Skin. John Edgar Wideman, whose fiction and memoirs constitute a scathing indictment of what Wideman has called the American darkness. Louise Erdrich, whose minutely chronicled magic realist interwoven tales of Native American lives in the northern Midwest constitutes an achievement to set beside that of William Faulkner. The literatures of North America and Australia have in common, among other parallels, a fascination with the mysterious, ever-emerging histories of each great continent. If the predominant mythopoetic image of America is that of a conquest of a vast wilderness, with all that conquest implies of the brutal and often genocidal campaigns of the conqueror, the predominant mythopoetic image of Australia seems to be the exploration of the penal colony past. Wonderfully fertile for the writerly imagination, this drama of civilization's outcasts reestablishing and reinventing themselves in a wilderness as vast and inhospitable as the North American continent. And both cultures seem to have been slow to acknowledge the bellicosity and exploitative nature of their settler myths in their presentation of themselves, slow for decades, but now involved in courageously revisioning the past. Since the contentious 2016 American election, the United States has become a highly politicized society. Issues of public support of the arts, freedom of speech and of the press, the role of the artist in speaking truth to power have become primary. Recently acquired civil rights of women and minorities, lesbian and gay communities have come under attack from white nationalist right-wing sources and have proved distressingly vulnerable to government edits and intervention. With an authoritarian government that would suppress free speech or eliminate it altogether, it is ever more crucial that artists and writers stand together in unity. Censorship is the blunt, killing cudgel of power. Artists and writers must resist the temptation to attack one another, in this way giving support to repressive forces that will take advantage of divisions between artists. Some of us, or a few of us, may recall when the ultra-conservative mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani, tried to ban a work of art because it offended his Catholic sensibility with its disrespectful depiction of Christ. We have long been aware of public schools across our country censoring and banning books as central to our history as Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the autobiography of Malcolm X. Writers of the stature of Hemingway and Steinbeck, Ray Bradbury, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Kurt Vonnegut, Joseph Heller, J.D. Salinger, Ursula K. Le Guin, Sherman Alexie, and Judy Blume, among many others, have been targets of censorship. I was saddened when an idealistic young Florida high school teacher contacted me just a few months ago, first to inform me that he was teaching several stories of mine from my collection, High Lonesome, then a few weeks later, somewhat ruefully, to inform me, though the stories had aroused much discussion in his class, the students had been enthusiastic, a single letter from an upset parent was enough to intimidate the school principal into censoring the material. So that was the end of that. The ascendancy of right-wing political power in the United States, with its base in evangelical Christianity ideology, is likely to bring with it renewed calls for censorship of reportage about such incidents as police brutality against minorities. Any acquiescence to censorship is surely a mistake. We must trust the human imagination, its predilection for digging at the roots of things, for prying at what is fixed, for soaring boldly into the clouds. We must hesitate to suggest boundaries and perimeters. Let us strive to dissolve borders. In the words of the poet Thomas Kinsella, let us cultivate, quote, international regionalism. Is it better to provide palliative answers or to ask provocative questions? Is it better to carefully transcribe the close at hand, which can be safely confirmed, or to leap perilously into the unknown? Like explorers of new unknown worlds, artists should not shrink from crossing borders and boundaries in the service of their visions. It is not only science fiction that penetrates the unknown, but, it's to be hoped, the realistic novel itself, which is always in its innermost heart a work of prophecy. Art should, quote, speak truth to power. We should press for more invasions of the imagination, not fewer, more plunges into the unknown, more translations into major languages, more publishing projects that introduce readers to writers both emerging and established from cultures different from our own. Let there be no restrictions on any subjects. What if Harriet Beecher Stowe had been discouraged from writing on her sensational subject that, it might have been argued, should have been left for manly writers who knew firsthand about slavery? What if Eudora Welty's short story had been rejected for publication on the grounds that an older, genteel white woman could not possibly write with authority about a crude, uneducated white racist murderer who happened to live in her own Mississippi hometown? We need more radical and subversive art from the margins of society that challenge the authority of the center. More quirky, stubborn, rebellious voices to counteract the ubiquitous drone of social media culture. More public support for all the arts, visual, musical, theatrical, dance, and not just the arts that reflect our own convictions. If our art sometimes provokes hostile reactions, this is but the price we must pay for our commitment to bear witness in a turbulent world. Yet recall Milton's beautiful sonnet on his blindness, which ends with the line, "They also serve who only stand and wait." There is an art that is not an activist art that does not consciously bear witness to social and political conditions. There is an art that aspires to timelessness. There is an art that aspires to beauty, perhaps the beauty of pure forms. It may be a deeply personal art that is yet universal. It may be oblique and direct, subtle without being reclusive, an art that can be bold, even brazen in its uniqueness, revealing its intransigent truths in ways that are not obviously political or historical. The art of Emily Dickinson, for instance, written in the very shadow of the Civil War, in contrast to the ebulliently outward communal voice of her contemporary, Walt Whitman, who wrote directly of the Civil War. An art that, quote, tells all the truth but tells it slant, success and circuit lies. It may be the singular subjective art of the, quote, blue guitar of Wallace Stevens' poem of 1937, The Man with the Blue Guitar. They said, "You have a blue guitar, you do not play things as they are." The man replied, "Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar." In this way, the world is not captured nor reported upon, but uniquely mirrored. To write such a poem in 1937 at the height or the depths of the American Depression was a bold stand of the poet going against the grain of the era. It was Stevens who allegedly stood up at a literary gathering to make the statement, "I've been asked to speak of the social obligation of the poet. He has none." This provocative statement of Wallace Stevens is, after all, the essence of the artist: individual, stubborn, rebellious, uncharitable, and ungovernable. Art for its own unique sake and not for the sake of society. Art for the sake of individual vision and not for the sake of effecting change in others. In a time of crisis like the present, such quiet voices may speak as forcefully as loud voices. The small, still voice of which Doris Lessing spoke, though Lessing was herself an activist, socially involved, and visionary writer. The poet in the tradition of William Carlos Williams, in which the dailiness of life is celebrated and not its cataclysms. The poet in the tradition of Elizabeth Bishop, seeing in the near at hand something like the very cosmos. The subdued voice and not the vatic voice. The precision of language itself, which is a kind of devotion. Quote, "The sentence in itself beautiful," as Virginia Woolf has said. Does an exquisitely wrought poem carry a resonance far beyond the most vehement opinion piece? does an arrestingly original work of visual art, a work of beauty or problematic music, lodge more deeply in the soul than the most strident public art? The poet in the tradition of Milhaud, quote, "It seems that I was called upon this, to glorify things just because they are. The way of bearing witness and the way of the blue guitar. Through a lifetime, we are likely to be both, and urgently, we need both." Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. That was a marvellous talk and raised so many marvellous ideas. So you began by quoting the great American writer Edmund Wilson, who said that the artist is a person who's suffered a mysterious wound, one that never heals. And that is a common idea and one that you've scrutinised tonight. Well, what do you think makes that idea so appealing? Because it's such a widespread one, that artists are wounded and even that they heal their wounds at their peril, that they may lose their talent if they don't remain wounded. Why is that such an appealing idea, do you think?
Well, it's a sort of sentimental and self-aggrandizing idea. You sort of have a Woody Allen idea, inflating the self, and that the neurosis is just so cataclysmic and so grand. But there may be other people in the world who are more deeply wounded. It's just that they have the reticence, not to say anything about it. It's a sort of self-aggrandizement of the artist. And I don't really mean to be pejorative about it. I think it's probably it's a valid argument, but I think my own personal feeling is that art is the wellspring of energy and creativity and a desire to communicate with other people, perhaps to represent a community, to represent a kind of universality, and that it doesn't have to spring from neurosis or woundedness. That's my own particular theory.
Which contrasts with the notion of the arts as being a preoccupation that makes you better than other people.
Makes you what?
Makes you better than other people.
Bitter.
No, better. That you're a better person because you're interested in the arts. I mean...
Oh, you're better. Well, some people are bitter.
I know, it's an accent thing.
Well, there are many people who are bitter, I think, because they haven't done better, and they're comparing themselves with one another. And it becomes a kind of vanity, I think. And when we were all children at one point, you can all remember, there was a time when, as a child, we were just so happy and excited to wake up in the morning, and many of us were coloring with Crayolas, and it was kind of a happiness, and then your grandmother says, "Oh, this is so beautiful," and there's nothing beyond that, just the happiness of the creativity, or drawing your own cat or some chickens or something, and it's like the spring. It's like a spring of naturalness, and I don't think that neurosis or woundedness or competition or a desire to win awards enters into that. To me, that's the most elemental.
Yeah. I was thinking about T.S. Eliot while you were talking, because when I was a student, I loved Eliot. I was a bit obsessed with Eliot. But I now think of Eliot as someone who is at odds with the human race, not someone who bears witness to the pain he sees around him, but a man who was almost repelled by the masses. Unreal city, so many, I had not thought death had done so many. There is, he seemed to me to be a kind of third kind of artist. If there's the artist of empathy and then the artist of the blue guitar, there's also the artist who's building art and culture as a kind of fortress against the vulgarity outside.
Yes, I think that's very well put, and also that's typical of the first decades of the 20th century. And recall he's from St. Louis, so he had a Midwestern accent. Then he went to London, and he remade himself into a kind of Anglican high churchman. So people who knew him from Missouri, they were wondering, where did he get this English accent from? It's such a self-conscious thing to do. And naturally, that leads a little bit into fascism and feeling that one is very much beyond the ordinary people. and he has these kind of nasty poems about Sweeney, you know.
Yes.
And Sweeney is an Irish person, you know, and sort of the jokes about the Irish from the point of view of the English, it just seemed like a kind of crass sort of humor.
And an anti-Semitism too, I think. Do you know that
Yes.
line, what's it in Sweeney Among the Nightingales?
Yes,
Is it
yes.
Rachel Nay Rabinovich
Rabinovich, yeah.
tears the grapes with murderous paws?
That's right, yes.
So
Yes.
when you read lines like that, when you twig to the fact that you've got an author who holds these misanthropic ideas, does that shape the way in which you then read the work? Or are you able to say, well, that's just the man, the poetry is entire unto itself?
Well, that's another issue altogether. I think it's a very interesting and debatable issue. And we could talk about it for a long time, because if you're a feminist, I mean, most women today, I think, certainly writers, are feminists to some degree, but does that mean that we just can't bring ourselves to read Hemingway, or we just can't make ourselves read someone Faulkner? I think that we have to somehow compartmentalize and see that this is egregiously sexist and, you know, male chauvinist pigs, the whole lot of them, a huge farm yard or barnyard. You know, I mean, really, it's just, if you're a woman and you're sensitive to these things, you just see it in all these great writers, and certainly the anti-Semitism in Ezra Pound, and the misogyny and sneeringness in the great moderns, and all these things are sort of obviously there. But if you sort of acknowledge that, but then you sort of go around on the other side and say, well, formally and in an aesthetic way and historically, they have much to offer. The early short stories of Ernest Hemingway are very beautiful. And if later on it became evident he's an anti-Semite and he's a misogynist and all these other things that are not fashionable today, though actually in my country they're all sort of coming back, you know. I hope I don't say just the most awful things that I won't be able to go back and we're also afraid, you know, of what's happening. Every day there's a new drama in the United States, but those of us who are not in the United States still, we have to get back somehow. So I mean, I can't even answer your question because it's so fraught with issues that make people tremble. You know, if you are a woman and you're reading some of this misogynist material, you just sort of start to quiver and quake, and you feel it's so unfair. And if you're Jewish and you're reading anti-Semitic material, if you're black and you're reading this also. So do we have to just write off all these people, or can there be some way that we can appreciate them? So as a professor, I've been teaching for a long time, I really have to teach these works, and we talk about it quite openly, but I try to be very impartial and fair, and I do a lot of teaching of Hemingway's short stories because he's such a really wonderful writer.
We sometimes talk about writers not as if they're wounded, but as if they're possessed, as if their minds are taken over by the artistic experience, as if there's a sort of derangement almost.
Well, not so often a novelist. I mean, you can't be deranged for 800 pages. You can be deranged for a poem this long. But you know, at a certain point as a novelist, I think that we are the long-distance truckers, that we get in the big truck and drive all across the continent. I mean, do you do that in Australia? Because we do it in North America. The drivers are all taking amphetamines, I think, that they're sort of going along. And then you get there, then you go all the way back. You know, that basically there's, it's like a working experience, you know, the working actual. So if you're waiting to have a great inspiration, you may wait a very long time. You just have to basically. But what you touch upon is Plato's argument against poetry, that the poet is not in his right mind, but that a kind of god or demon speaks through the poet. And I think that's very insidious. I don't think it's true at all. I think that's a misunderstanding of what imagination is. You can have a long period of hours of feeling inspired, but when you're all done, your critical process takes over and you reread it and you start editing it, and You may decide that you don't like it and you throw it out because it's not good enough. You're not possessed by it in the sense that you are passive. You're making lots of selections and judgment.
I mean, that's why Plato mistrusted poets.
Plato pretended to. I'm not sure that it was true.
We can't ask him now.
Well, the totalitarian imagination always distrusts the artist because the artist is an outsider. The artist may be a woman, may be gay. The artist is not the conformist. The totalitarian authority wants everyone to be conforming in his own image, perhaps. And so the outside people are excluded. I don't think Plato really believed that the artists were not in control of their own work. I think he didn't like the idea that they may be rebellious. And as you probably know, there were poets in ancient Athens who were like rock stars, and they gave readings, and there were enormous audiences. And there was a seething kind of excitement that the philosopher didn't experience, that Plato wouldn't have experienced that himself.
So you cautioned us against being too self-righteous, either as an artist or someone who's engaged with the arts. But you also talked about artists as you said that artists must have something special, otherwise we'd all be artists. And you were talking at that point about the artist as a person who is bearing witness to other people's experience.
That's one avenue.
Yeah. Let's talk about the bearing witness aspect some more. Is that related to kindness in some way, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I grew up in a very impoverished part of upstate New York on a small farm in a community. Well, it wasn't much of a community. It was sort of out in the country, and we went to this one-room schoolhouse. But though my family did not have much money, it was a family, and we lived with my grandparents on a farm. But there were some of my classmates had very broken families, and their fathers were abusive to them. My closest girlfriend, who is my age, suffered terribly from an abusive father who was an alcoholic in her family. And I always felt like a sister to her. And I always felt when I was writing that the difference between us was so unfair because she was a very nice girl. And yet she was so afraid of her father, and eventually the whole family split up. And we're still in contact, actually. But I always felt when I started writing that I would write about someone like her because her story was so tragic, and yet she herself, I think, was courageous. And there are people in my own family, like my own parents. They both had to start work when they were very young. And my mother was actually given away. Her family was too poor. There were 9 children in a family, and she was a baby. She was given away. So they had a hard life, but they never really talked much about it and never complained, ever. And so when I started writing, I thought I would write about my parents and my grandparents and sort of vanishing Americans, because now everyone complains about everything. They don't have much to complain about compared to these older generations, but there's a sort of confessional fad in America. But I thought I would write about these reticent people who had much pride, and they didn't complain, but they were very courageous. And I think they did suffer, but they didn't talk much about it. So I was actually quite middle-aged when I found out about my mother. She basically didn't talk about that. So in my writing, I feel I'm bearing witness to these people who were not educated at all and who never wrote anything.
So sometimes politics is about drawing the reader's attention to, not just to a reality they don't know about, but often to a suffering that they don't know about. That there seems to be a kind of assumption that the readers, by and large, are in a kind of safe place in society, and it would be good if they understood that it's not so great for people who live in other parts, and the writer can open their eyes to that part of society they otherwise wouldn't see. And there's a politics
definitely.
in that.
Yeah. Well, it may be just part of feeling sympathy for other people. But I was mentioning Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that was such an astonishing work at the time. People in the North knew about slavery, but they didn't really know it feelingly. They didn't have an emotional sense of it. And the abolitionists were intellectuals, like Emerson and Thoreau, and they spoke to small audiences. But Harriet Beecher Stowe was a woman writer. She just started, writing in a way that allowed hundreds of thousands of people to know what slavery was like really from the inside. And that was such an imaginative leap. So basically it had an extraordinary effect, really extraordinary effect upon society. Probably maybe the greatest effect that any work of literature has had. Now today maybe films and online internet information may have that same sort of galvanizing power to open people's eyes.
Does Uncle Tom's Cabin feel as though it engages with the politics of the present day? Do people read it now to open their eyes in the way that we've been discussing, or has it become now a work of its time, a work of historical interest?
Oh, it's a work of historical interest because it seems very melodramatic now. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is a novel that I've also taught, and that's about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And Upton Sinclair was only 26 when he wrote that. That's another in this series of what we call muckraking novels. And that is a novel that you can read today, and basically it's about work in a slaughterhouse. It's about the exploitation of human beings who are also exploiting animals. So there's a certain sympathy for the worker who's badly treated, but then the animals are so horribly treated. And that's somewhat contemporary, though it's also historical. Nabokov said very sneeringly that all these novels about ideas, novels that try to change people's feelings, that is basically a lower form of art. But I don't think that's true. I don't think there are higher and lower forms of art.
But one of the reasons Uncle Tom's Cabin feels melodramatic is that it has a very clear moral universe. So
Yes.
there is virtue and there is villainy.
Yes.
Whereas when you're writing, it seems to me, in the new one, let's say what happens. You've got a story in a Book of American Martyrs where you've got basically a evangelical Christian, a man of little education, who murders, assassinates a doctor who's an abortionist, a sophisticated, educated man. And you write the book both from the point of view of the killer and from the points of view of the dead man's family and other people as well. And so we're seeing both how reasonable it was to take the action that the assassin did, and also how reasonable it was to be the doctor and be the man he was.
Yes.
So that sort of pluralism really contrasts with the more political kind of... Well, it's a different way of doing politics, I guess.
Well, that's an interesting point. I think I'm a novelist in a way that Harriet Beecher Stowe was a propagandist. She had a moral position. She was a Christian. But when I write, I wouldn't want flat characters who are villainous, even though I think in the world there are these flat characters who are villainous, really. But if I write a novel, I want to make it seem worthwhile to the reader that he or she is reading about real people rather than propaganda cartoons. I think that even people we see it from a distance who behave egregiously, from their own point of view, they probably have some principles, they're doing something that makes some sense to them.
If you've pulled this one off, Joyce, and I think you have, is a test of that a reader who was in favour of women's control of their own reproductive nature, that someone who was actually pro-choice would read the book and see their own worldview reflected in it, but someone who was a militant anti-abortionist would also read and think, oh yeah, she's been fair. That's what we think.
Well, I don't really know. I'm not sure whether those people, I use the word those people kind of self-consciously, I'm not sure that they would read the novel. I don't mean that to be funny, I just mean the fact. I mean, I don't really think that they would probably read that novel. I can't imagine, maybe I'm mistaken. I did get a letter from a woman who said she was the daughter of a Christian martyr who had, I'm not sure if he killed someone or he just vandalized, and he was in prison. She said she felt that I had presented her father's worldview correctly. That's what she said.
And did you jump for joy, or did you think, oh dearie me?
No, I had thought that I tried to the best of my ability to present it correctly. So what she said was not that surprising to me, is that they're very sympathetic people. I mean, really, the assassin is somebody who feels he has to do it. He doesn't really want to kill another person. He feels that God has selected him. Now, we might say that there's mental illness involved. Does he hear voices? Well, he's been told by his minister and other people that abortion providers are evil. He's been brainwashed, but still he's choosing to do this. So he basically doesn't really want to do it, but he feels he has to do it. So there are martyrs for all sorts of causes. There are martyrs for the environment. There are martyrs for protecting animals used in experiments. There are people who have martyred themselves to protect animals. And they've martyred themselves for civil rights. They've been, in the 1960s, there were people who died in the American South who are white people who are promoting the cause of civil rights for black people. I mean, these are people who become martyrs, but to the other side, they are the enemy. You know, it's a sort of a complex situation. Is there anything for which one would be a martyr? Probably many of us pushed far enough, we probably would sacrifice a lot for our principles. But most of us don't have to do that. We don't feel called upon to do it so existentially and so directly. But there are many people, like in emergencies, there's always a certain percentage of people, I don't know what the percentage is, there are always people in an audience, you know, they come forward in an emergency and they help other people. And they save people and they carry people on their backs. You know, they do all these kind of insane things that they don't think they were going to be doing, you know, at 6 p.m., that the fire would happen at 10 p.m., and people find themselves doing these things. So what makes people heroic and what makes people martyr, I think is a mystery, and it's kind of interesting. Because everyone in Luther's congregation heard the same sermons that he heard, but he was the one who went out and actually killed somebody because he felt that God wanted him to. Now, is he mentally ill? Is he self-deceived? I don't know, but under our law in the United States, he's guilty of homicide. So whatever people think internally, if they break a law, they become a criminal. So maybe sometimes it's best just to look upon the law, and the law decides these things rather than people's intentions, if that makes sense. So that's that's a kind of political position that I put my faith in the rule of law.
Because tonight you've made it very clear what your political sympathies are. I mean, you actually said that you had sympathy with the liberal, pluralist agenda of most art, and you talked about Trump as a threat to all of that. I mean, I was wondering when I was reading the book whether there was any kind of battle in your soul between the political Joyce and author, Joyce, because this ability to see the world from so many points of view, to give them their due, is exactly the opposite of politics, because in politics you want to stand up and say, ladies and gentlemen, tonight I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to give you the moral position. And those people over there, we need to marginalise them because they're bad.
Yeah,
that's what
true.
politics is.
Well, ultimately, like most writers, I'm a formalist and I really love the art. I mean, painters love paint and musicians love their instruments and writers love language. So I'm going to say that ultimately or immediately I'm a writer and I want to write a work of art where people might inhabit and they would say, this is a reflection of the real world and I don't feel it's an editorial or propaganda. If I want to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times, then I would have this sort of flat, dogged voice, which I don't find very interesting. And I don't like to read things only from my own perspective. I'd like to read a novel that surprises me with its sympathies for something I hadn't thought of before. I'd like to read a novel or a short story or see a movie that really is kind of startling. I don't always want to see the same thing in which I already believe.
Well, Richard Flanagan's The Narrow Road to the Deep North
yes.
is an example of this, isn't
yes.
it? Because you expect the book to just go on being sympathetic to the prisoners of war and entering to their suffering, then suddenly it turns around and sees the world from the point of view of the Japanese captives.
Yes, I think that the writer, even Dostoevsky, who was such a self-conscious sort of Christian, ultimately the writer triumphs over the propagandist, I think. And most writers are like Shakespeare only in the sense that Shakespeare loved a good scene. And Shakespeare loved a good dramatic scene. And so those of us who are novelists, we love a good chapter, a good dramatic scene, and that's got to be the first priority. So like Shakespeare, we love these characters who may be a little wicked. Iago is a terrific character. You wouldn't want him to be your brother-in-law, You wouldn't want him to be your husband's best friend. But there's something about Iago. He is just such a terrific character, and actors love to play Iago. And then in King Lear, Edmund is a great character. Stand up for bastards. And Shakespeare understood that these quote, evil characters are the fuel that gets the drama going. And Cordelia, though she's not evil, she's another one of these people who doesn't do what she's supposed to do, so she kind of starts the drama by speaking too truthfully. So ultimately, that's a good point. I'm more of a writer than I'm a political person.
And a literary writer, because literary writers do like that pluralism, unlike more popular writing. If you think about a lot of fantasy fiction, the moral universe is very clear. There's good versus evil, there's humans versus orcs. The world is being invaded by people from another planet who have to be fought off. There are certain kinds of writing that rely on moral clarity, moral polarities, I think.
Well, that's interesting. I don't really read that sort of fantasy. So I read and I write dark fantasy. Dark fantasy is more morally ambiguous.
It's more complex, yes.
It's more complex, yeah.
But you see, well, let me share a thought with you. I have the sense that we are wired to think in simple polarities of men and women, of good and bad, of north and south, of freedom and oppression.
Yes.
And that what art can do and what literature can do is to help us to think in a more pluralist way,
yes.
to understand that in any conversation there are not two voices, them and us, but many voices at a round table. And that's somehow at odds for some reason with the way we're wired up.
That's interesting. Yes, I think you're probably right. And I think that we're hardwired to believe in certain stereotypes.
Such as?
Well, the old wise man, the wise old man with white hair and white beard, or what, It's sort of like that image of patriarch. Somehow that seems to be imprinted, that people will believe the most egregious nonsense if it's uttered by this old wise man. particularly if he has like an Irish accent or. I mean, I'm not really I'm sort of part Irish, but I have friends who are Irish poets. You know, they can say the most obvious blarney and nonsense. It just doesn't matter. It just sounds so wonderful. You know, like the beautiful lies that they're telling, just like music. But I think hardwired is actually quite right. It's a neurological phenomenon. So how do we disentangle this? We're hardwired to be xenophobic. We're hardwired neurologically to be suspicious and afraid, therefore bellicose toward people who look different than we look. We're hardwired to feel empathy for people who look just like us. But if eyes are a little different, or people who are misshapen or disfigured, or different skin color, then we have a neurological aversion that has to be overcome through education or through parents teaching. You know, in other words, we have to overcome our nature. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I think so, but it's also our culture, because you can live in a culture that tells you that people are different because they have red hair. I heard a story the other day of a girl who lived in a country town who was bullied and tormented because she had red hair. Well, the school I went to, no one ever picked on anyone for red hair. There were other things you could suffer for, but red hair wasn't one of them.
I know.
So, these ways in which we define ourselves as the ones and the others as the other are culturally regulated. But nevertheless, there seems to be some impulse to divide the world into these two camps rather than think in this more...
Well, it's a mysterious issue, but where does culture come from if not biology? So, I mean, culture...
When I was little, I thought there was an opposite to everything. You know, there was pepper and there was salt, there was hot and there was cold. And I think, what's the opposite of a tiger? And once I realised there wasn't an opposite of a tiger, there were just a lot of animals. That's when I started to...
We feel that culture arises somehow out of biology and neurology, let's say, out of the human brain. But at the same time, cultures are very different. So why are cultures so different? Some are just much more democratic and diverse. Others are much more rigid and authoritarian. And yet they do all spring out of the human psyche. It's not an issue that we can decide tonight, but it's a very interesting issue.
Now, all of this brings us, I reckon, to the question of the writer's voice. There are some writers who you can pick if you read a paragraph or two. So if you think about Hemingway, you read a paragraph of Hemingway, you'd know who it was. D.H. Lawrence, I reckon I could pick on a paragraph. Jane Austen, you could probably get. But there are some writers who are so good at vocalising other positions, I'm not sure I could pick them. I'm not sure I could pick you. Would you think that was true of you, or do you think there is a voice?
Well, you probably couldn't, but I could.
Yeah, but that's not really the test with respect, Joyce.
Well, let's take an example that other people might know. All the different chapters of Ulysses.
Yeah.
Now, in theory, the chapters of Ulysses have a different voice, and some of them are pretty different. And yet, you can sort of tell that's James Joyce.
It's all Joyce, yeah.
It's all Joyce, but yet they're very different. Leopold Bloom's, particularly as the novel goes on late into the night, the sentences get different. Some words get very short. And Joyce is just this brilliant experimenter with language, and yet we think we could probably pick out the Joycean rhythm, and that's what's so wonderful about Ulysses. But when I write, I'm trying to use the word vocalizing, which is such a good word, but I'm trying to let the people speak who are my characters as if they were in a play or in a movie. So the characters are speaking. I'm trying to get their speech down without my narrative voice. Whereas James Joyce almost always has a narrative voice, and he doesn't have people talking that much. It's mostly like his voice. I will try to disappear and have the people speaking. So it's not so evident that I've written something because these people are speaking. But I've done that very deliberately.
Yes, and you've totally pulled it off. When I was a student at Melbourne University, in those days, we had to do a subject called dating. And in a dating exam, you would be given, 6 paragraphs of poetry or prose, and you'd have to say who it was and why. And the lecturers loved to tell us it didn't matter whether you got it wrong as long as your reasons were fine. You know, if it was medieval, if it was someone parodying the medieval form and you said it was medieval, that would be fine. Yeah. So I reckon if you were on a dating exam, Joyce, I would never know who it was.
Well, I have written some novels in which the idea was to have a language that was sentence structures that were very complicated with colons, so that everything is held in suspension, or really long sentence, everything is held in suspension. But then I've had some language where the very short sentences are sort of punchy, just short, you know. And so the long sentence is very 19th century by definition. And the shorter sentences, oddly enough, are much more contemporary. The sort of sentences that Hemingway was writing, very different from what Henry James was writing. So you can date a little bit. In the 18th century, you would always be able, 18th century English, you could always recognize, I think. It's very distinctive. The great prose of Jonathan Swift, for instance, it's just so elegant, but it's very 18th century.
Let's talk some more about Donald Trump. You talked about the modern dark ages.
You just want me to get somehow in trouble.
You won't get in trouble. I'll ask you nice questions. Yeah. What's his appeal? That is the key question.
You're asking me?
Yeah. Well, you live in America. The world is looking on and thinking, this is strange. What's he appealing to?
This is strange? That's the understatement. Must be British understatement or something.
What's he appealing to?
Pardon me?
What's he appealing to?
Oh, are you really asking me these questions? It's sort of like a softball coming slow over the plate. Is she really going to hit that softball? Oh. Well, I've been tweeting insanely since the first debate about Trump. And a whole lot of people have been tweeting, you know, with whole tweet storms going on. It doesn't seem to make much difference. There's a sort of like a fireball of populism, I think, and maybe it is like wildfire. A feeling of resentment of a so-called master race, because it's not really a master race or something like that, you know, sort of belated fascism. I don't really know. Probably anybody else would have as many ideas as I do. First of all, Donald Trump didn't win the popular election, actually. He lost by 3 million votes. That's tremendous. And he may have had a lot of help anyway from Russian interference. So it's not at all clear that our democracy failed. It was the Electoral College and the apparatus that failed. So the Democratic voice of America did not elect. He didn't really get elected. But let's say he had a strong minority of many white, disgruntled, resentful individuals who overlap a bit with outright racists. So it's not everybody who voted for Trump, I'm sure, is a racist, but there's a kind of overlap and a lot of virulent white nationalism in the United States. So a lot of us were shocked and demoralized by that. I thought after Obama, or during the example of Obama and Michelle and so forth, I would have thought that America was morally better than it turns out to be. But it may well be that it's a pendulum and that will swing back the other way. I mean, how do you feel as a person not there with the wildfire? I mean, how does it look to be in a sane place? I used to go to Canada. The last time I went to Canada, I thought, I used to live in Canada. I thought, oh my God, I'm in a sane place. a Commonwealth nation. It's just so wonderful.
And
that
yet so terribly cold.
But then I had to go back. No, Canada's not that much colder than, no, not where I lived. I lived south of Detroit, in Windsor. Windsor, Canada's south of Detroit. No, it's just that there's a feeling of the common weal in the Commonwealth nations, where in the United States it's more like this old stereotype of individualism. Everybody's carrying a gun. They're carrying their guns, their machine guns, or what can I say? It's like a nightmare of masculinity.
Let's have some questions from the audience. If we bring the lights up and find some microphones, we can get some questions. So pop your hand up if you'd like to ask Joyce a question. Do wait till the microphone comes to you. So there's one right down here. So you need to sprint down. We got it here. Yeah. I've got you there. So right here in row number 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're in this region and you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up now so I can move to you. Okay, behind it. Yep.
Hello. I just wanted to ask a question on the idea of bearing witness. Some of my favourite books of yours, Joyce, involve very unreliable narrators. And I just wanted you to just speak a bit to that tension of, on the one hand, bearing witness suggests that you're learning something about speaking to truth, but on the other hand, some of your characters, even when you read their stories, it's sort of, the book in large and small ways is undermining the truth of what they're saying, or suggesting that they are not the best authors of their own stories. So just wondering if you could speak a bit to that.
Well, it's a kind of challenge when you're writing a novel to provide the reader with an experience that's more than the character's experience, so that the characters may be partially ignorant, but they learn through the novel, they become more self-aware, because the novel should take a character through some trajectory. But then the reader presumably knows a little more than the character, so that there's a sort of doubleness. If I write about somebody who is very willfully self-deluded, I would feel that the reader would sort of understand that. But then taking both the reader and the character through a plot, you get to a point where things are more obvious and more evident. And I usually try to resolve a novel in the last paragraph or so that the last sentence is something I've been aiming for. I was going to say a minute before that, in the United States, I'd be really afraid in an audience the size that people would be armed. The parts of the United States, like the Southwest, like Arizona and others, they're just sort of carrying their guns around, and some people are afraid to go in those states. Travelers' advisories have been offered in some states, like Missouri.
Thank you very much for your speech, Joyce. I just wanted to ask, we had last year, we had Lionel Shriver here, and we had a bit of a storm at a writers' festival, at a subsequent festival that she was at, where a young Muslim female blogger walked out of her speech when she was talking about characterising people who are outside her as a white woman. I wonder where you stand on that, because I think you were talking about censorship earlier, and I wonder if there's a sort of a potential for censorship of, I hate the phrase, but of political correctness and kind of oversensitivity to difference. And I asked that in the context of what you were saying with Harriet Beecher Stowe and the power of that work, writing about something outside her own direct experience.
Well, that's a very provocative question, and I think it's a debatable issue. And I would more, because maybe I've been a professor for so long, I would more like to hear what other people thought, like in a community, in a writer's community of people who are hypersensitive about having suffered in the past, just to be respectful of them, but not to make that a principle of censorship, somehow to use common sense and respect, that you wouldn't want to be like Evelyn Waugh, where you're satirizing people who are different from yourself because they don't speak English quite the way you do, or they didn't go to Oxford or something. There's a certain magnanimity that you would. exercise. I didn't hear Lionel Shriver's speech, but I read parts of it, and what I remember from reading is that she may have had some liberal ideas, but they were so aggressively satirical and kind of arrogant or whatever. So there wasn't the respect that one might expect. So if I write about people different from myself, I usually would have a character like myself in the narrative talking to a person not myself and learning something rather than mocking a difference. So I think respect for other people and common sense, maybe that will defray the issue of censorship. Maybe there wouldn't have to be any. Oh. Thank you. That's very touching. I feel that you're fellow writers and that you see it's really hard issue.
Let's take a question from this region here. There's a microphone there. Is anyone in this region like to ask a question? Up the back? Can I see a hand at the back? It's like an auction. Can I see a hand at the back? Yes, there. She's coming. They're coming from both sides. Be brief with this. This is the last question. So ask your question. Yep.
Joyce, you mentioned fear, and I'm curious because your words are often so brave, and I'm thinking in particular of Blackwater and of your short story, Dear Joyce Carol. Do you actually, how do you feel when you approach these stories, and do you expect any comeback? Have you had any negative comeback? And if so, could you tell us about that?
Well, that's another very interesting question, and I've been teaching writing for some years, and sometimes a young writer will come to me. It has been, in fact, usually a young woman writer rather than a young man, though men may feel this way too, but it tend to be women who come to me, and they're so concerned with what their families are going to feel. And they feel that they have a real story to tell, but that if they tell the story and their families read it, they'll be just so disappointed and so angry and disgusted with them. And so it's an issue of how much your art means to you. Is there some strategy that you can present your art to the world without incurring a good deal of emotional punishment? Because it's very hurtful. I have actually had one friend who had a novel in which there was a mother character. It wasn't really negative, just sort of, flawed. Her mother didn't speak to her for 2 years, and she loved her mother, and it wasn't a harsh portrait. And yet you don't know what people are going to see. Sometimes they see things that you didn't put in, but they also don't see things that you did put in, And so you can't tell. So one way around it, which I've suggested to these young women who are so anxious, would be actually to write under a pseudonym. And when you think about the pseudonym that's androgynous and doesn't have a sex assigned to it, the first feeling that you have if you write under a pseudonym is one of tremendous relief and freedom. Where suddenly you're not connected with it, and suddenly a lot of imaginative fuel and energy, like explosion, can come out. And it's not that you're going to be lying or making anything up that you don't feel, but you now have the freedom to put it all out there and not worry what your mother's going to think, or your husband, or your wife, or your children. And that is a tremendous relief for many writers.
That's where we must end. Would you thank Joyce Carol Oates?